In this section, we'll set up our database and deploy it to AWS. So from the home page, let's go under Services, and then under Database, click on RDS. And RDS stands for Relational Database. And here we are. We're at the dashboard for creating databases. However, before we can create a database, we must first create a subnet group. So let's go on Subnet Groups, and then let's click Create DB Subnet Group. And a DB subnet group essentially is a way to protect our database against failure. So if you remember before, we set up 2 private subnets in different availability zones. And we did this because we're going to deploy them in a subnet group. So because they span 2 availability zones, there's a very low chance of our database being accidentally deleted for some reason in case a server in AWS fails. So this is the point of having a DB subnet group. It's to ensure reliability and security for our database. So here we'll first name it React Full Stack Group, and then we'll just give it a description of subnet group for VPC3. And of course we'll need to choose VPC3. And then we can now add the subnets. So remember the subnets in their availability zone that we set up previously. And we only need 2. And these are both our private subnets that we set up when we were setting up our VPC in the beginning. So we can add both of these here to our subnet group. And then that's it. We can just click Create. So we're now ready to actually create our database. So let's go on the Databases tab and then click Create Database. So before selecting a database engine, let's go at the very bottom and click on the Only Enable Options Eligible for RDS Free Usage tier. Because again, we don't want to be charged for just practicing our AWS skills. So make sure you have this option checked. And then we'll of course use PostgreSQL as our database engine. Then we can click Next. So we can leave all the settings in the instance specifications to default. We don't need to change anything here. For settings, we can first specify the database name, and this is going to be, let's just call it dbname5. In master username, I'm just going to use my username and then set a password here. And then we can click on Next. And now we have the options to set up our VPC. So under the VPC, we don't want the default VPC. Let's select VPC3. And then for subnet group, let's select the React Full Stack group that we just created a second ago. And we don't want this to be publicly accessible, so we'll leave that to no. Availability zone, we will just leave as no preference. And we'll set up our VPC security groups in a second. So let's just leave this as create new VPC security group. And then the actual database name we'll set as the same, dbname5. So it's very easy to get confused between the database identifier and the actual database name. So for that reason, I recommend just keeping them both the same. So remember, in the last step, we set the database identifier, which is a name on our AWS dashboard, to dbname5. So we'll just keep it the same here to avoid confusion. The port we can leave as the default, and this is the default PSQL port 5432. And everything else we can leave default as well. So for backup, I'm going to do 0 days, and I'm going to do this because it will create the database much faster, but in a real app, you would probably want to make this a week or 2. But again, just to save time and just to create our database very quickly, I'll just set it to 0 days here. And everything else we can leave default, and we can go ahead and go to the bottom and create our database. So while our database is being created, we can take this time to set up our security groups. So let's go to the VPC tab and do this now. So let's go to the security groups tab, and then we'll call this React Full Stack DBSG. And this will be our database security group. And remember, this is different from our web security group that we set up. And of course, we want this associated with our VPC3, which also holds our web server. So after creating the security group, let's edit the inbound rules. So we'll do a custom TCP rule. We'll do port range 5432. This is the PSQL port. And then the source is going to be 10.11.1.0/24. remember, this is the CIDR range of our web server subnet. So our web server subnet will be able to communicate with our database through the security groups. And this is how we do it. We block all other incoming traffic except traffic that's coming from our local subnet that the web server is in. And this is how we establish communication between our web server and our database, because otherwise how would we store data from our web server to our database? And the answer is we can't. This is the only way we can do it, by communicating through the local routing. And this is how we enforce that no other traffic is going inbound into our database. So this is a very important security measure, and one you really have to understand. Otherwise, if you did not do this, anyone would be able to send inbound traffic to the database, and this will obviously be very, very insecure. So we can go ahead and save the rules. And it looks like our database is available. So let's go ahead and click on it and add our security groups. So let's go ahead and click on the modify button. And then let's go ahead and select the React Full Stack DB SG that we just set up. And let's go ahead and click on the apply immediately button. And we can ignore that potential unexpected downtime. This is just a demonstration. So a question you might have is, if our database isn't publicly accessible, how would we connect to it? We know that our web server can connect to it, but how do we connect to it from our home computer, if we can even do that? And this diagram explains essentially how we're going to do it. We're actually not going to directly connect to our PSQL database from our home computer, because again, remember, our PSQL database is not publicly accessible. It is not connected to the internet at all. And it's also in a private subnet that doesn't even have a internet gateway. So what we do is we first connect to our EC2 instance, that is our web server. Then through our EC2 instance, we then connect to our PSQL database through the local routing. So this is essentially how we're going to do it. We're not going to directly connect to the database from our home computer, but we're going to do it through the web server, the EC2 instance on our VPC. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's log into our EC2 instance with SSH. And then the first thing we need to do is actually install PSQL. And how we do this is sudo Amazon Linux extras install PostgreSQL 9.6. So this command is basically saying that we already have PSQL on the machine. It simply is not installed. So you get a lot of default software with your Linux Amazon AMI 2. And one of them is PostgreSQL. So we can just install it from our Amazon Linux AMI. We don't need to download it from an external source first. And I know these commands are hard to see, but unfortunately I can't really zoom in on the terminal. So I will have all the commands I run on the terminal in a text format in an article I'll link in this module. So just, if you can't see one of the commands, just look it up in the text article I'll include also in the module. And I'll also give a brief explanation of each command as well in there. So you can check if PSQL was installed correctly by checking the version, and it seems it did. So we can see what commands we have available to us from PSQL by running the command psql-help, and this lists all the commands that you can use with PSQL. So let's now try to connect to our PSQL database from our web server. And remember, this database is not hosted on this web server. It's hosted completely separately from AWS RDS. But we're just going to connect to it here from our terminal. So we'll do first PSQL, and then we'll first need the DB name. Remember, this is the database name that we set when we were setting up the Amazon RDS. And it's going to be DB name 5. Next, we're going to need the host name, which is under endpoint on the RDS dashboard. Next, we need the port, which is under the -p flag, and it's going to be 5432, which is a standard PSQL port. And next we need our username, which was myname125. And we actually don't need to enter the password because it's going to prompt us to enter in a password anyway. So you wouldn't include the password here in your initial attempt to connect to PSQL. And let me try one more time. Let's see. And here we go. We've successfully connected to our database from the web server. This is awesome. This is unbelievable, right? We are on a web server and we connect to an Amazon RDS in a private subnet not accessible by the internet. Pretty cool. So we're not done yet though. We have to enter in our SQL commands that we set up in our schema.sql file in our project. To here in our terminal, we have to enter in the SQL commands so our database structure can be set up. And we can just copy and paste the commands. And now after creating these tables, let's do /dt. And there it is. There is our database right there and ready to go. Awesome.